Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's great to be here. So the first lecture that I will give is on the crisis of liberal democracy. And the lecture is entitled Democracy in Retreat. Democracy is in retreat. After spreading around the world since the 1970s, the last decade has seen a rollback of young democracies in very different countries. In countries such as Poland and Hungary, which are both part of the European Union and NATO, but of course also in Turkey, in some of the BRIC countries, and in Venezuela. And why is this important? Because a lot of these countries were seen as very positive examples of transition to democracy. Venezuela was a dictatorship in the 1970s and 80s, and then became the most successful Latin American democracy in the 1990s. Poland and Hungary are always seen as the best transition countries in Central and Eastern Europe after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Turkey was seen as the one country that could combine Islam and democracy. So if democracy is in retreat in these countries, something very significant seems to be happening. But it's not just in transition countries where this is the case. Democracy is also in retreat in so-called established democracies. If you think about the quality of democracy in America, in Britain, in France, in Germany, in many other countries that have had democracy for longer, that quality of democracy is surely declining. Everyone agrees with that. What people disagree about is the causes and what can be done about it. But the decline of the quality of democracy, I don't think, is really much disputed. And there are numbers to support what I'm saying. According to the 2016 Democracy Index, the total number of full democracy has fallen to just 19 countries in the world that can be called full democracies. And the United States are classified as a flawed democracy but one that isn't working very well. Now you might say that's no news. People have been skeptical about American democracy for a very long time. The money, the power, sure. But it's not just opinions now. This is now something that we can measure. Okay, so this becomes a slightly different conversation. Not what is your view about America, but actually there are now very hard facts, if you like, to really back this up. So this is not about anti-Americanism. This is now something which many, many Americans who previously thought that democracy was working are now in agreement about. And it goes on. You know, if you look at the report published by Freedom House every year, then there the number of democracies and the quality of democratic standards has also been falling for 11 years in a row. 11 consecutive years of a decline of the number of democracies and a decline in the quality of democracy. Now, it's true that almost half of the world's population live in some kind of democratic system. But only 4.5% of the world's population live in a full democracy. 4.5%. So less than 5% of the whole world population live in a full democracy. And that used to be more than 10% 10 years ago. So we are seeing this very significant decline. Now, in the literature, there is talk about democratic recession. This is what the American political scientist Larry Diamond talks about. In other words, democracy is no longer spreading, right? It's retreating. And other people, Robert Foer and Yascha Mounk, even talk about democratic deconsolidation. That democracy doesn't become more consolidated, just the opposite's happening. It becomes weaker. And what's really interesting about these two arguments is that it goes against the expectation in 1989. In 1989, with the fall of the Iron Curtain, the expectation was twofold. Democracy would spread to countries that hadn't had democracy before, and democracy would deepen where it exists. Now, over the last 25 years, what we can now say is that the number of democracies is declining, not increasing, and the quality of democracy is also declining and not improving. That's a very significant reversal of the expectation we had 25 years ago. Now, there are lots and lots of debates about exactly the empirical evidence and exactly the causes for this, but there's no question now that democracy is in retreat. Right? 10 years ago, that was not an accepted argument by many. Now it's becoming a new consensus. What I want to focus on in this lecture is liberal democracy more specifically. So I'm not going to talk about the whole world, and I'm not going to talk about every different democratic system that there is. I want to focus more specifically on liberal democracy. And the reason is that liberal democracy has always been presented, especially since the end of the Cold War, as the model democracy. Okay? So everyone from Francis Fukuyama to other influential theorists have said the world is converging towards liberal democracy. Right? Not any kind of democracy, the Western model of liberal democracy. And I want to suggest that actually that model really is in a very deep crisis indeed. Let me just give you a little bit of context before we go on to the analysis of exactly why it's in a crisis. The Brexit vote, okay? Britain leaving the European Union, the election of Donald Trump, the strong support for the Front National in France, right? Which got, after all, nearly 37% in the second round of the French presidential elections in May. The presence of the party AfD, the Alternative for Germany, in the German parliament now. You know, all the anti-establishment parties around liberal democracies that are doing well. The Five Star Movement in Italy, that may well be in power after the next election, right? And insurgent parties almost in any country all show that liberal democracy is not really working very well. And certainly it shows one thing, that this idea that somehow liberal democracies give you peace, prosperity, and partnership doesn't seem to be true. There is not necessarily peace within those countries. There are lots of conflicts. There isn't necessarily peace between those countries. There can be all sorts of tensions, not necessarily war, but certainly tensions and some other conflict, ideological conflict, economic conflict, cultural conflict. And also, it doesn't give you partnerships. These countries are now divided internally and between each other. Okay, the European Union, that was always expected to grow, have more members, is now losing a member. Right? It may be losing more members. The Eurozone is clearly in a state of crisis. Turkey, that was supposed to join the European Union at some point, is moving further and further away from this. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is not necessarily the main question. It's just an observation that liberal democracies are not producing the peace, prosperity, and partnership that they have promised. And really, this is very, very significant because if you look at the main promise, which is that of prosperity, this is the main problem that now seems to be characterizing liberal democracies. So for a long time, the idea was, you know, after the Second World War, after 1945, after terrible conflict for so long in Europe and elsewhere, we were going to see, you know, more wealth, right? That generations would be better off. And it's true, the generation that grew up after the Second World War was better off, and the next one was again better off. But what's happening now in America? What's happening in America is that actually the American middle class, which was once the largest class, and really, if you like, the embodiment of the American dream, right? Anyone can make it. With hard work, you will be successful. America provides opportunities for its people, right? All of these assumptions simply no longer hold true. It's now the case that the current generation of 18 to 25-year-olds in America are starting on lower salaries than their parents when they were 18 and 25. Right? So the idea that every generation is better off than the previous generation is not true. That is the definition of progress. It's not happening. Okay? It's now the case in America that the top 20%, okay, in terms of income and in terms of assets, are monopolizing access to good quality education, school, college, right? They're monopolizing access to good housing, so safe, secure, in a nice area, access to healthcare, because they're the only ones who can afford private healthcare, and public healthcare in America, as we know, is very bad, even after the Obama reforms, and also monopolizing access to good jobs, jobs that give you an income, a growing income, you know, jobs that allow you to get on in life. But it's not just in America this is the case. In Britain also, levels of social mobility, in other words, the ability to move up in terms of income and social class, is falling. And in certain parts of Britain, the levels of social mobility are back to levels not seen since 1920. Okay, so this is a reversal of progress for certain parts of the population of 70, 80, 90 years. Right? This is very significant. Right? This is not a minor crisis. This is not just a blip. This goes to the heart of liberal democracy. And if you think of those political events we've seen over the last few years, Brexit, as I mentioned, the election of Trump, Front National, AFD, and all the other parties, what is that? It's a popular rejection of a certain ideology that no longer has majority support. What is that ideology? We could, if you like, summarize it as the dominant Davos dogma, which is what? Obviously, Davos refers to the World Economic Forum. It's a certain view of the world. One where if you have low wages, deindustrialization, trade deals where you export jobs because it's cheaper to have things produced elsewhere, and if you have endless foreign wars, somehow that is the future of the world. Well, the populations in those liberal democracies are rejecting this now. They no longer want to live with low wages because they can't feed themselves and their families. They don't want to lose all their industries because these are jobs that actually pay something and have meaning. They don't want to just live in a precarious economy of low-level services. They don't want trade deals with other parts of the world where they lose all the jobs. And they don't want their countries to intervene militarily all over the world. Okay? There's now a majority rejection of this ideology of the last 25 years. Actually, we don't understand this evolution of democracy unless we take seriously some ideas that we have inherited from a very long tradition of political thinking. And that tradition actually goes all the way back to the founding fathers of Western politics. And now by Western, I don't mean Western European or American, I mean Western in the intellectual sense. I'm talking about, of course, ancient Greece and Rome, where thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, Cicero actually were the first ones to think about democracy. What is it? How can it be successful? What are the dangers? And so on. And the four ideas I want to develop here this afternoon with you is, the four ideas are as follows. What I want to suggest to you is that democracy today risks sliding into oligarchy, which is the concentration of power in the hands of very few people. Demagogy, the fact that we don't discuss values or we don't discuss some form of truth, we just have a competition of opinion that are manipulated. I want to discuss the risk of anarchy, that actually democracy leads to a lack of order, to a breakdown of society. And finally, the risk of tyranny. And that risk is perhaps the most difficult to define because I'm not saying that democracy is becoming dictatorship. That's not necessarily the case. America under Donald Trump is not a dictatorship. Okay, there are different powers. You can see the conflict, for instance, between the White House and the inquiry, right, led by Robert Mueller into apparently, Russian interference in the election. That shows you that the president doesn't have all the powers. There's a Supreme Court, there's Congress. Okay? You have some kind of separation of power in America. You have a separation of power in Britain. You have a separation of power in France and Germany and so on. So it's not a dictatorship that's developing. But what's developing is some form of what the French political thinker Alexis de Tocqueville called the tyranny of voluntary servitude, that citizens are becoming less involved, that citizens are not quite as active in shaping democracy, and that there are other powers, unelected, unaccountable powers, that actually are influencing things much more, which are the powers I've already talked about: oligarchy, demagogy, anarchy. Okay? So we're not seeing despotism or tyranny in the ancient sense, we're seeing more a form of voluntary servitude. Citizens are simply not part of democracy. And this is why when they then vote against the consensus, there's a big surprise. When they vote for Brexit, the elites are, disappointed. When they vote for Trump, the elites are disappointed. So occasionally, the voters still express their views. But if you look at other countries, majority views are often ignored. Okay? Majority views about identity, majority views about culture. And this is the problem of liberal democracy. It simply eliminates those who don't really agree with the ideology. That's the tyranny of voluntary servitude I will talk about. So let me take you through these risks in turn. So I will start with oligarchy. And again, I want to stress that these are just risks. I'm not saying that all Western countries are just oligarchies. That's too simple. I don't want to suggest that all Western countries are simply demagogic. You know, again, that's too simple. I don't want to suggest they're just completely anarchical and there's no order. I'm just saying it's a risk, and liberal democracy, I think, is now sliding into that sort of state, more so than 25 years ago. Okay? So this is, if you like, a trajectory, and this is where we could be heading if things don't change quickly. So let me, first of all, talk about oligarchy. Why do we see the drift of liberal democracy towards oligarchy? Well, we're seeing it because liberal democracy has not been very good at transforming the economy in a way that prevents oligarchy. You know, the promise of liberal democracy after 1945 was you build an economy for everyone. Everyone benefits. Everyone gets a fair share for their efforts. You work hard, you get on in life. Okay, that was the promise. But now what we're actually seeing is a lack of opportunity for many people. I already mentioned young people have lower incomes, have higher debt, don't get housing, don't find, you know, schools for their children, don't find, you know, stable jobs. But it's even worse than that. We're seeing a growing concentration of wealth and power in the hands of very, very small economic actors. Let me just give you this as a figure. In 2017, so this is the year which is now ending, 2/3 of all the economic sectors of advanced economies, so all the sectors from a little bit of agriculture that's left via manufacturing industry to all the service sectors that you find, 2/3 of those sectors are characterized by greater concentration of ownership and control than in 1997. So what have we seen in the last 20 years? Not the spread of opportunity for everyone, no, just the opposite. Fewer and fewer businesses and groups control all the wealth and all the economic power. Now, we of course can think of monopolies and cartels and so on. If you think back to the big tobacco companies, some of the biggest food producing companies, the car industries, and of course finance. Think of Wall Street and the huge power that Wall Street has in America, or the huge power the City of London has. So we know all the big banks and what they did less than 10 years ago in the financial crisis that is still hurting many ordinary people. But it's not just that we're seeing this in some established sectors. It's happening everywhere in the economy. And the reason why we can talk about monopolies is this. We have dominant players that are in fact giant trading firms which dominate the entire production system. So for instance, Walmart, the supermarket chain in America, doesn't just sell you food, it controls the whole process from food production via distribution to selling it. That's why it's so powerful. If it was just a supermarket selling things, it wouldn't be so powerful. But it's a big trading company that squeezes the farmers, makes them sell their products very, very cheaply, controls the whole distribution so that no one else can compete, and sells you all the food that you're buying, if you live in America, where you're buying it. That's why it's a monopoly, because it controls the whole supply chain. Okay? That's what we have to understand. So what you and I see is just a shop. We don't see this huge business empire, but it's there. Secondly, they don't really eliminate competition, but they're shifting it. Because what they do is they basically introduce competition between the workers, between the suppliers, between the producers. So it's not that Walmart competes with other supermarket chains. Then you would get a balance, then you would get cheaper prices, right? If you have some competition, you have 2 or 3 or 4 supermarkets, you know, no. Walmart is everywhere. Very often people only have access to Walmart because it's the big supermarket in the area and there's no other. And then Walmart basically forces its workers to compete against each other so that the salaries are low. It forces the suppliers to compete against each other so it can buy food really cheaply. That's how it makes these huge profits. Okay? So it's like a business empire. It's almost like an octopus that has its tentacles everywhere. That's how we have to understand it. But of course, think about it, because I've only been talking about the old economy. I've been talking about tobacco or banks or food. Where are the biggest monopolies today? It's of course the tech giants. The big tech companies that are now dominating our lives from the morning when we switch on our telephones to the evening when we switch off our laptops. And in fact, most of us don't even switch off our phones any longer. They're on all the time. Most of us don't shut down our computer, we just close it. These things are on 24 hours a day, and we are on our electronic gadgets, how many hours? 18? Sometimes 20 perhaps? And we are checking Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and email all the time. Everything happens via our phones, right? I can buy a house and a car with this at a stretch. Not quite a house, but a car. I can travel with this thing by booking my tickets, okay? And we organize our professional and private lives with these gadgets. Who controls them? Not us, the companies that stand behind them. Amazon, where we buy most of our CDs, books, whatever. Okay, I'm talking, again, liberal democracies. You in Russia have still some other, companies. In China you have Alibaba, but the principles are becoming similar. Apple, right? I have an Apple laptop. I'm no different. Facebook, Google, Microsoft, all the big tech giants are now, can you believe it, if you add them all up, so the Western ones, but also Alibaba and a few other ones, they represent $3 trillion US. Let me say that again, 3 trillion, not billion, trillion. And 3 trillion is roughly 1/6 of the total value of American GDP. That's how much they control. It's absolutely enormous. It's never existed in world history as far as we know. Okay? And of course, they heavily dominate the market. Facebook has over 3/4 of all mobile social network traffic in the US. More than 50% of American adults use Facebook every day. Over 85% of all new online advertising goes either to Facebook or to Google. Okay? They have completely monopolized the online advertising market. Facebook now has 2 billion worldwide users. It's the biggest community, if you can call it that, in the world. No one has more members than Facebook. And of course, it goes on, because in 2016, Google had 97% market share of all new people who join basically the online world. So 97% of people who buy a smartphone or a laptop use Google. 97. That's a very large number. We're talking about the West, but still, that's also still a big part of the global economy. Okay, and of course these big companies constantly buy up smaller ones, they buy the new applications. So Facebook bought WhatsApp for $17 billion US. You might say, well, the people who developed WhatsApp, they got very rich. True, but can you imagine if Facebook is prepared to spend $17 billion on WhatsApp, how much it's valuable to them? And why is it so valuable to them? Not just because of the value now, because if you don't buy it, then it will become a big competitor. And what's the best way to eliminate competition? You buy your competitor. Mergers and acquisitions are the biggest driving force of monopolization. Okay, and it's happening everywhere in the economy. You get the drift of what I'm saying. So in other words, we have monopoly in the economy, but of course the consequences for democracy are really serious. Okay, the first big change we're seeing is that capitalism is not becoming more democratic, which is the promise after 1945, a balance of interests, accountability, everyone gets a share. No, it's democracy that's becoming more capitalist. That's a very big difference. Democracy is now controlled by big money. Think of America. How much does it take to run in an American presidential election as a candidate? You will have to be able to raise roughly $1 billion US in order to compete with your opponent. Where do you get that sort of money from? Well, Donald Trump used practically none of his own money, even though he's a billionaire. He, of course, had it raised through the Republican Party. Where did they get it from? Big donors. Where did Hillary Clinton get 3 times the money that Donald Trump had? All from big business. Who else? No one has that money. And even President Obama, when he first ran, yeah, he got $20 donations from lots of people, but $20 times 100,000 isn't all that much. Where did he get most of his money from? 85% of the Obama contributions for his campaign, also from big business. It doesn't matter who you're talking about. Trump, Clinton, Obama, Bush, it's all the same. It's all big money. Okay? So democracy is becoming much more dominated by money. That's the reality. We like it, we don't like it, we think it's a good thing or a bad thing. That's another judgment, that's another debate. But that's the objective situation. And of course, it's not just that money finances politics. It's also that you have very, very small groups who effectively control power. Now, we do have institutions. We have parliaments and governments. We have courts. There is a certain, as I said, separation of powers. True. But you look at some of the people who run these institutions, then you actually get a sense that the elites are always taken from similar sort of groups. They have very similar backgrounds. In America, it's all the same universities, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, Harvard, right? All the Ivy League universities. Demographically, these are all people either from the West Coast or the East Coast, right? And they all come from certain elites. These could be old elites, old family dynasties, or new classes, sort of new emerging groups. So old elites are, for instance, if you think about it, the political dynasties, the Kennedys, the Clintons, right? These are old kind of political dynasties in some sense. They've been around for, 20, 30 years. The Kennedys have been around for 60, 70 years. The old elites are also the captains of industry. Right? All the big, the car companies. Ford, right? That's a big family. Before that, Rockefeller, Andrew Mellon, these old elites, right? They've been there for 120, 150 years. But we also have new ones. Things don't stay the same. New elites emerge, and they work with the old elites. So who are the new elites in America? It's the tech oligarchy. It's all the people coming out of Silicon Valley. It's the Mark Zuckerbergs. What's Mark Zuckerberg trying to do at the moment? He's traveling around America to see whether he might be a viable candidate as a Democrat, candidate in 2020 to run against Donald Trump, which of course would be very ironic since Facebook allowed the Trump campaign to reach many people, to mobilize, and to win an election that Hillary Clinton was supposed to win. So in some sense, Mark Zuckerberg created a platform that the Trump campaign used very effectively to win. So the irony would be rather interesting if he then ran against Trump in 2020. And I think if he did run, my sense is that Trump would win. Because the majority of Americans are not trusting Mark Zuckerberg with their political future. He doesn't represent them. He represents a very, very small section of the population. Even if they use Facebook, they do not necessarily agree with his values. I'm just saying, it's not a prediction. I'm merely saying that it's a strong possibility, I think, that if Trump runs again, and if he runs against Mark Zuckerberg, I think he wins again. Again, don't quote me on this, because I've been wrong in all my predictions in the last few years, so it's probably another wrong one, but still. So you can see just how much democracy is dominated by both old elites and new classes and this monopoly economy. Let me move on to demagogy. Why is there a risk that democracy slides into demagogy? Okay, what is demagogy? Demagogy is basically the triumph of opinion over any kind of truth or any kind of objective values, but more importantly, the manipulation of opinion. The fact that we use means of trying to close down real debate about fundamental issues. Okay? Now again, I think demagogy isn't just something that the opponents of liberal democracy do. We talk about populism a lot in the last few years. Okay, Trump is a populist, the Front National are populists, right? The AfD, all the ones we looked at earlier, they're all called populists, right? But who calls them populists? The liberal elites. Why do they call them populists? Because the liberal elites are not in agreement with something that has mass support, which goes against their views. Right? That's all it is. Who was the first one to practice populism in politics in recent decades? The liberal elites themselves. Why? What did they do? They dominated the media. They told everyone this was the only model. Right? They were the ones saying end of history. They were the ones saying there's only one model, and that's the Western one. They were the ones saying you have to like globalization. They were the ones saying you have to like military interventions, like in Iraq. They were the first populists in the sense of manipulating people's opinion. So everyone does it in politics, okay? There's very little difference. Whether it's liberal populism or anti-liberal populism, it's populism, okay? Populism in the sense of opinions, will of the people, okay? Trying to say, I represent the will of the people, right? And so in that sense, everyone really is demagogic. But it's even more sinister, you could say, than that. Because liberal democracy itself constantly uses demagogy or populism as a sort of enemy against which it defines itself. So what the liberal elites do is they not only manipulate opinion, right? We're saying we have to like globalization, wars, you know, the Western model of democracy and so on. They also, of course, are very technocratic. Right? They always say, leave it to the experts. Experts know better. Okay? If the experts tell us we need more globalization, let's do it. More trade deals, more deregulation, more liberalization of finance. And then technocracy, of course, always produces a backlash because ordinary citizens don't trust technocracy. Ordinary citizens say we're not represented by technocracy. So what happens is that technocracy is then seen as, you know, a safe option. Oh, think of all the populists now. Think of Marine Le Pen. Think of Trump. Think of Nigel Farage, who was leading the Brexit campaign in Britain. These are dangerous people. We need more technocrats to save us from them, right? So this is an endless movement. More technocracy, more anti-establishment politics. Right? These reinforce each other. And liberal democracy knows this and does it quite deliberately. There's always been technocracy versus populism in Western politics. You know, think of the American president Andrew Jackson. He was exactly like Trump, or the more historically accurate way of saying is Trump is very much like Andrew Jackson. He was a president in the 19th century. Right? But America has always had this. It's always had insiders and outsiders. Okay? And Western politics has been like this for a very long time. So this is not new. This is not very different. This is just an intensification of very long-standing trends. Technocracy and anti-establishment politics. It happens all the time. And so when people say liberal democracy is the best model, it doesn't do demagogy, it's just not the case. It does do demagogy. Maybe in more subtle ways, but it does do demagogic politics. Okay? We don't talk about principles or values. We don't talk about things that most people believe in. We basically talk about opinions. Right? And that is what liberal democracies do. They manipulate opinions. Their opponents manipulate opinions. As I said, everyone does it. Now, let me move on to the next point. But before I do, perhaps I should say this. Why is liberal demagogy perhaps different from, say, totalitarian demagogy? Okay, so why is this not quite the same as a dictatorship of, you know, someone like Hitler or Stalin or, you know, Mao Zedong in China or, you know, maybe the North Korean regime now? What's different? Well, what's different in liberal democracy is that at least there's some appearance, some, you know, semblance, some appearance of a debate. Right? The media, for instance, in liberal democracies is not completely controlled by just one power. Okay, we do have different media. We have the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, where they're owned by different companies. Okay, we have some public television, we have some private television. I mean, there is a media plurality. Okay? Whereas, of course, in totalitarian regimes, there's only one media, which is the state media, period. Okay? So that is a difference, and I think it's important to acknowledge it. We don't live in a dictatorship. And of course, we could say, there's not just the old media, there's now the new media. Right? A lot of people now think the hope for democracy is social media, right? Online. Now, we've already discussed who controls the internet, or who controls at least our access to the internet, the tech giants. But you know, there's something else going on online, which is very dangerous for democracy, which is that we don't really have a lot of debate between people who disagree with each other. Because what happens online is that people choose those media that they agree with, they follow the people on Twitter who they agree with, they are friends with people on Facebook who they agree with. You see where this is going. And this is what we call these very vast global echo chambers. You are never really opposed to other people's views because you choose who you follow, right? That is your choice. And so most human beings, not all, but most human beings tend to choose people that they agree with. And then that gets more and more and more reinforced. So what happens, for instance, in election campaigns? That's why online campaigns can be so successful. If I send you a link to, for instance, a video of Donald Trump or Jeremy Corbyn, right, in the most recent British election, or the AFD or the Front National, and if you're friends with me, you will probably not only like the election, video that I'm sending you, you will press the buttons that says I like it, and you will share it with your friends, and they will do the same. And so it gets amplified and amplified and amplified. Okay? Now, of course, it's not true for all of us. As I said, I follow lots of people on Twitter who I don't agree with because I want to hear what they have to say. You, I'm sure, do the same. But we are, in that sense, not representative. Most people online have very clear views and won't have them challenged. And it gets even worse than that in liberal democracies because this online echo chamber is now beginning to exist, not just online, but even offline. So let me tell you very briefly, before I move on to the next point about anarchy, let me tell you briefly what happens at some universities in liberal democracies. Some universities now have what we call safe spaces. What are these? These are not spaces where you're safe from, burglary or rape or something. No, safe spaces where you are protected in terms of your political views from anyone who disagrees with you. So universities now have a policy where they don't invite certain speakers. It's called no platforming. I'm not going to give the platform to someone who I disagree with, even if their opinions are democratic. We're not talking about people who preach hatred or violence. No, we're not talking about people who come in and say terrorism is great. No, political disagreements. And we create a safe space where if I give you a lecture in my university, not my own in this case, but other universities in the Western world, I have to tell you in advance if I might say something that might politically offend you. I have to give you a health warning, saying I'm about to say something which you might disagree with. So I'm just warning you that this might be the case. I mean, this is no longer a university. This is no longer free debate. This is no longer free inquiry. This is now a form of censorship. Right? It's quite subtle, but it's a form of censorship. So what's happening online is now also happening offline. And it's a real danger that we have to be aware of. And then think about how the online and offline ways of controlling opinion are spreading, and really it's a form of mass surveillance. What we think politically is something that people can now track. They can track our every movement online. They can track even our opinions offline. I can switch this thing off, and still people could, in theory, record everything I'm saying. Because this technology is such that even when it's off, it's not off. Right? Now, I'm not saying everything is a conspiracy. There's one person in the world who wants to dominate us. This is not the thesis. But I'm talking about the theoretical possibility of mass surveillance. And if you think back to the scandal of the National Security Agency in America, which under the presidency of Barack Obama, was discovered to have spied on Western leaders. Chancellor Merkel's telephone was effectively tapped by the NSA, an ally. Now, we all know that every country tries to get information on its opponents or enemies. That's always been the case. You can go back 3,000 years. People send spies to other courts in other countries. That's common practice. Everyone does it. But when you begin to spy on your allies, you kind of think there's something rather strange going on, right? So again, democracy is very much compatible with demagogy. It's compatible with the manipulation of opinion. It's compatible with a form of surveillance where you do not encourage free critical debate. Right? It's a tendency. We do have some independent press and media. We do have some form of debate in parliament, but we shouldn't think that that is the norm. That's probably beginning to become the exception. Okay? And again, it's the risk I'm talking about, not just where we are today, but where we could be in 5 or 10 or 20 years if this continues. The third element I want to talk about is anarchy. Now let's be clear, when I say anarchy, I don't mean what in Russia often goes by anarchy, which is certain thinkers of anarchy. I don't have that in mind. I don't mean anarchists who go against certain political regimes. No, by anarchy I simply mean social breakdown. By anarchy I mean effectively that democracies don't encourage social cohesion. Democracies don't really support a sense of national identity around certain values. And it goes back to this problem with opinion. Democracies don't believe in absolute values or principles. They don't really talk about what we share in common. They talk about our individual opinions. But the moment you only talk about opinions, you never talk about what binds you together with others. You no longer talk about what makes us citizens of the same country, right? What makes us members of certain groups. No, you just talk about your opinion and yours and yours and yours and mine. And what do we have in common? Nothing, except that we all have opinions and they're a bit different. And we don't really talk about what binds us together as citizens. And this is happening not just politically, where patriotism, right, national identity and so on has become less fashionable in the eyes of the elites, especially the liberal elites, but it's also happening at all sorts of other levels. Think of family breakdown. Almost 52% of children in Britain are now born outside of marriage. Now, you may think it's a good thing or bad thing. Again, that's a separate debate. I'm simply observing the fact that marriage is no longer seen as the main institution when it comes to having children. It's a big change. It's a huge change. All right? Everything is getting easier, from abortion to divorce to euthanasia. Anything that we might have thought was to do with life, to do with certain, as we say in anthropological terms, certain taboos about what you do to human life, is now becoming a matter of choice. If it's your choice to, put an end to your life when you're suffering with an illness, that's now becoming more and more legally possible. Okay? It's all about individual choice. That's all liberal democracies believe in. And if you just believe in individual choice, what do? You give power to those who can exercise choice. But who can exercise choice? The wealthy and the powerful. The rest of us don't have always choice. Right? The rest of us can't afford a divorce. So divorce is actually sometimes only for the rich, and it's seen as a kind of glamorous thing. Oh, I got divorced, I have a new wife or a new husband. Right, it's all very exciting. But other people don't think divorce is a good thing. Most people think divorce is traumatic, right? For themselves, for their husband or wife as well, for the children above all. Okay, so there's a sort of glamorization of things like divorce and all sorts of other practices that really can undermine society. There is an element of freedom here, which is important. I mean, liberal democracies say they believe in freedom and equality. These are two important values. And you don't want people to be, trapped and locked in a marriage that isn't working, where you're really unhappy, maybe you're abused by mostly your husband. So of course, there's an element of freedom that's important, and some element of, some freedom to have a divorce, of course, is important. And divorce should be available to all, right? That's the principle of equality. It can't just be for the rich and the powerful. But the problem is, where's the support for family structures? Where's the support for national identity? Where's the support for the things that create social bonds? If you don't create social bonds, what do you get? You get a lack of trust. People no longer trusting others. You get a lack of cooperation. People don't work with others because they don't trust them. And when you get a lack of trust and cooperation, what do you get? You get a society that's increasingly individualistic. If you get a society that's increasingly individualistic, you get a society, again, where people don't think of themselves as members of communities or groups or the nation, where people actually think of each other as competitors, where people think of each other as possibly even enemies, where people think of each other as simply separate human beings with which they have nothing in common. And that's a very dangerous thing, because without trust, cooperation, and solidarity, very few countries can really flourish. Now, we know all sorts of bad forms of solidarity. We know collectivism, right, where everything is decided from the top down. That's That can be dangerous. We know it from the dictatorships. Again, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and so on, sure. But there's surely some difference between collectivism, or some middle point between either collectivism, which is one extreme, and individualism, which is the other extreme. And liberal democracies are more and more moving towards the extreme of individualism. Okay, and that is a genuine problem. It creates social fragmentation. It creates all sorts of problems which mostly the rich and the powerful can escape from. Most other people are left with those problems. And here comes the final point I want to make, which is the point about tyranny, as I said right at the beginning. This is both the most difficult but also the shortest point in this lecture. And the point is this. When you get more and more individualism, as I've just said, you actually never just get only individualism. Because think about it, what happens if you have a society that's just made up of individuals? You get, as I said, conflict. Why? Because you have rights, and you have rights, and you have rights, and you have rights, and I have rights. But sometimes these rights, actually quite often, these individual rights clash. Okay? Your right, for instance, to health, and my right to choosing to smoke, they clash. If I want to smoke in this classroom and you don't want to be exposed to smoke, we have a problem. This is obviously a very trivial example. It's not a very good example because that has already been decided. Smoking is not allowed indoors. Fine. Right? The state has made a decision. It's not good for human beings to expose to smoke. You can now only smoke outside and not here and not in bars. It has been settled. But it doesn't stop there. Because in Britain, we now have a law that says you cannot smoke in a car if someone in the car is below the age of 18. Because you shouldn't expose children, minors, to smoke. Now you might say it's actually very sensible, isn't it? Why should some selfish father or mother, or a friend of the family, smoke in the car where there are little children who will then be inhaling the smoke? So on the surface, you might say, makes perfect sense, right? Good idea. Isn't that progressive politics? But the trouble is, where do you draw the line? Because the next thing that will happen is that people will not be allowed to smoke at home. Right? Because at home, you could expose your children to smoke. Now, that's not right. And we keep on basically passing more and more laws to regulate social life in every sphere. In education, in health, in transport, in anything you can think of. There are laws, regulations. And this is the point. When you get individualism with individual rights and freedoms, you must get someone who can actually arbitrate the conflict, make some decisions. Who gets their right and their freedom to do certain things and who does not? Which is that power? It's of course the state. It's always the state. And when you get extreme individualism, you actually, through the back door, get also new forms of collectivism. Now, they're not the same forms of collectivism as I said, in the past. It's not despotism. We're not talking about ancient despots. We are not talking about 20th century tyrants. We're talking about new forms of collective power. State regulation, state laws, all the people who enforce it, right, and the interests that they represent, which are not really the interests of majority people. But what's really fascinating about this is that, again, it's not new. It's not something which we've only seen in the last 25 years or so. This has been a constant threat to democracy for a very long time. And I want to read you a quote before concluding this lecture from Alexis de Tocqueville. Okay, I already mentioned him, a French political thinker who, of course, traveled around America nearly 200 years ago, in the 1830s, and wrote a very famous book on democracy in America, right? One of the most famous books on American democracy in the 19th century. And here's what he wrote nearly 200 years ago. It's quite a long quote, so I will read it slowly and then we'll just go over it because I think it's really fascinating. He writes about the American federal government, okay, the American state. He writes this: "It's the supreme power that extends its arm over the whole community." Right? These are Tocqueville's words. It, the supreme power of the state, covers the surface of society with a network of small, complicated rules. Minute and uniform, so very detailed and the same everywhere, through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate to rise above the crowd. So this applies to everyone. And he says basically it's stifling energy and dynamism. The will of the man, so the will of every citizen he means, is not shattered. It's not completely destroyed, but it's softened. Right? It's slightly weakened. It's bent. Right? It's pulled in a certain direction. It's guided. Men, he means citizens, are seldom forced by it to act, but they are constantly restrained from acting. So it's not a dictatorship that tells you what to do, but it sort of stops you from doing certain things. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. It does not tyrannize, so it's not a tyranny, but it compresses, it enervates, it extinguishes. It stupefies a people till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals. So we're all made to be more controlled, less rebellious, more compliant. Right? You can see where this is going. And who, of course, is the shepherd of this flock, this group of timid and industrial animals? It's the government. Tocqueville calls this, and I quote, servitude of the regular, quiet, and gentle kind. So it's not a tyranny, it's not a despotism, it's a form of servitude. We're all becoming effectively serfs. It might be combined more easily than is commonly believed with some of the outward forms of freedom. So we are still free in some ways. We have certain abilities, right? We can study where we want, we can travel and so on, but we're also becoming more caught up in the servitude. And it might even establish itself under the wing of the sovereignty of the people. So we might say we live in a democracy where the people are sovereign, but who's really in power? It's the government. And the government acts by making everyone, be caught up in this servitude. So what I'm suggesting to you this afternoon, and I will now conclude, is that liberal democracy is in a new crisis. It's retreating, the numbers of democracies are falling, the quality of democracy is also declining, but that we're not just talking about functional democracy, elections, parties, right, media, no, it's something much more fundamental. We are seeing essentially the forces of oligarchy, demagogy, and anarchy that are rising. And what are they producing together? They're producing what Tocqueville called this tyranny of voluntary servitude. As citizens, we become less and less powerful, more and more dominated, controlled. And that, of course, is very serious for democracy, because democracy is all about the sovereignty of the people. But if we as people, as citizens, are no longer sovereign, if we can no longer make choices that have consequences, if we can no longer hold people in power to account, then, of course, democracy is really no longer democracy, it's becoming something else. And that, I think, is the great risk for liberal democracy. It's perhaps not yet happened anywhere fully, but my argument is that liberal democracies in the West are sliding into oligarchy, demagogy, anarchy, and this tyranny of voluntary servitude. And that is a different kind of crisis, and I think one we need to take very seriously. Thank you very much.